I worded it specifically that way, the American experiment, because I think that that's I guess, the most logical, detached way I could probably address it. And it gives me a good framework to think it through. So every experiment scientifically has to have a hypothesis. So the hypothesis, and I think the best indication of a hypothesis that I can find from our mythos, from our history, is the preamble to the Constitution, because the Constitution is really the distillation of these values into specific categories. Like, these amendments all speak to what it means to construct a government and a society off of these ideas of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and the consent of the governed, which was a big portion of it, because that's pretty much your answer to serfdom. And so, the preamble, I don't know if you want, I can be more accurate by pulling it up, but
I mean, if you need to pull it up.
Sure. I'll whip it out real quick. So
phone's over there.
My phone's over there. So I won't whip it out real quick. Never mind. Strike that from the record.
Someone's going to use that clip against us, by the way. I'll whip it out real quick.
Right.
Actually, I won't whip it out real quick.
He's flip-floppy. He can't make up his mind.
That's not where I was going, but okay.
I know. But yeah, it's the preamble, and I'm gonna not directly quote it, so forgive me.
Okay, well, how do you feel? What is the essence of the preamble?
Well, it's to form a more perfect union, to provide for justice, and I forget the third one, but like I'm pointing directly at the more perfect union. So the idea of this was like to use these values, to use this application and these guidelines and these inalienable rights as they saw them as the foundation to create something that they saw was more perfect. And the thing that I find interesting about that is that that's carefully worded, because it's not perfect. They had no disillusion about the fact that, or no delusion rather, that that what they were doing was going to be the best thing that they could possibly exist, right? Which is part of the reason why in the in how they structured the Constitution and the American government and the division of powers, it allotted for things to change. It allotted for things to adapt.
Because they weren't going to get it right the first time, and they did not get it right the first
No.
time. All men are created equal. Hashtag not really.
Which, came through in another amendment to that said Constitution. And what's interesting about that is they were having an argument about that when the Constitution was written, about whether that applied to slavery, and they were split on that. So there were definitely men even back then that were looking at it, and like the groundwork was laid for the 13th Amendment already, because the men that wrote them, especially if you're looking at the Federalist Papers, like Hamilton was actually really big on this. He was very anti-slavery. And so those liberties had to apply. The idea of all men are created equal had to apply to these men as well, to black people, to who they were enslaving at the moment. And so even though we can acknowledge that, for instance, if you're going to take a lot of the criticism, especially the historical criticisms of the BLM right now and them tearing down statues, some of which I'm actually totally fine with. It's more of how we do it. But, because, do we need to have Confederate statues up all over the place? Not necessarily.
No, they lost.
Yeah. That is how history is usually written. So, put them in museums, allow us to remember that these things happened.
Yeah, never forget that it happened,
Right.
but don't glorify it.
Correct.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, a lot of those statues were also not put up at the time of the Civil War. They were
Right.
put up more recently, as an answer to the Civil Rights Movement. I think those can come down.
Yeah, no.
For sure.
But, it's also just like we have a process for how everything else is done. If you, the other thing that the founding fathers and thinkers of that time period were careful about was they also knew that liberties came with responsibilities, that liberties also came with certain what they would consider to be reasonable restrictions. And so even though if you're going purely off of the value of liberty, right, it makes sense for a group of people who are in the right, let's say in the case of the statues, they're in the right morally, of that these statues should be taken down. Some of them, at least. We can argue about particulars, but the ones that we agree on, they can be taken down. Is that decided simply because a large enough group of people are adamant about it enough to take it down themselves? Like, is that how you do it? Right? I mean, if you're a truly free, liberated people, the argument is yes. You should be able to take down whatever you want because that's what liberty means, right?
I mean, yeah, absolute free reign, sure.
Right.
Yeah.
But does that create a more perfect union? Because see, that's the thing where I feel like you have to couple these values with the intent of forming this particular type of government, these sorts of ideals.